Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. It marks something of a milestone because it's the 20th in this series that we've been running during the COVID period. And today we take you to Lindisfarne Castle, a spectacular fortified building on the northeast coast of England, which in days gone by was a part of the world which was prone to skirmishes between the English and the Scots and to visits by marauding Vikings. The castle has a long history as a fortified building, and it now belongs to the National Trust. In Edwin Lutyens' day, it was owned by Edward Hudson, as many of you know, was the proprietor of Country Life magazine, who was a friend and important patron of Edwin Lutyens. And Lutyens worked on the castle for Hudson between 1903 and 1906. And then there was further work done in 1912 to 1913, which was stopped by the Great War. The National Trust in recent years, the current owners, has been carrying out a major conservation program, spending what I understand to be about £3.33 million on the work to waterproof and make the building good. And at the end of the webinar, there will be a time for questions and answers as we usually have. And before that, to tell you about the castle and this project, your two panelists today are Nick Lewis, who you are on the screen now, I think, Nick, is that correct?
I hope so, yes.
Yes, right. Nick is the House and Collections Officer of the National Trust at Lindisfarne Castle. Nick was born and raised at Alnwick, a town in Northumberland in the northeast of England, close to Lindisfarne and about 8 miles from the Scottish border. So he's used to Scottish skirmishes as well. Nick studied history at York St. John College and went on to do a master's in 18th century history at York University. From then, he went to work on the collections and archives of the Duke of Northumberland at Alnwick Castle before moving to Lindisfarne Castle in 2007. His companion panelist is Hugh Dixon. After studying history and fine art at Edinburgh, Hugh had a split career, first of all 17 years in Northern Ireland, where he was working on researching and promoting the concept of building history and conservation there. Then after that, 25 years at the National Trust, becoming curator for Northumberland and Durham, two important counties in northeast England, and responsible for much else, including Lindisfarne. In retirement, he is a conservation advisor to several important buildings, including the National Trust properties. So the only other thing I would mention is that at the end of the presentation by the two panelists, there will be time for questions and answers. There is a button at the bottom of your screens labeled Q&A. If you have a question, please put it in there. And it will be fielded and answers will be given in a time available at the end of the presentation. Okay, so if I may hand over to Nick, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Martin. Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about Lutyens and his work at Lindisfarne Castle. We will touch on the major conservation project that Martin mentioned towards the end of the talk. But first of all, I think the first slide I'd like to show you is, thankfully, a picture of the castle that Martin has introduced to you. So, Robin, if we can have the next slide, please.
Go ahead.
Can we get the next slide up, Robin?
It should be up, Nick. I don't know if you're not seeing it.
Okay, if you can all see it, I'll start talking. It's still the title on mine, but you should be able to see a rather beautiful sun-drenched picture of the southeast elevations of Lindisfarne. This was taken a couple of years ago, but if we go on to the next slide, we'll see a similar view from 1901. And this is pretty much what Sir Edwin Lutyens saw when he first came to the castle. This picture was sketched actually by Charles Rennie Mackintosh in July of 1901. And it would have only been a couple of weeks after that Edward Hudson, the proprietor of Country Life magazine, first visited the castle with a view to taking on the lease. If we go to the next slide, you'll see a young Lutyens and Hudson with a picture of the castle in between. This is the castle photographed in the 1890s. And although the castle hasn't really changed too much in profile to today, there certainly were some major changes made during the course of the works. With the next slide, you can see Hudson's first letter, one of his letters that he mentions Lutyens to the local landowner, the Crossman family, and he's shown his confidence in Lutyens to do the job for him, particularly his true knowledge of an old building. It's quite an important part of this, that Lutyens is working within an existing structure, and a very solid existing structure as well that's been there for several hundred years. Lutyens' response, you can probably imagine, was that of one of excitement. And the next slide shows a letter to his wife mentioning he's had a telegram from Hudson saying that he's got Lindisfarne and he's going to go and have a look. And it will be amusing, he says. And there's a sense of that throughout Lutyens' correspondence during the work, that he's thoroughly enjoying himself with this castle by the sea. The next slide, though, can give you a little bit of context as to what I'm talking about and where it is. So that you should be able to see a red marker there just off the coast of northeast England, and Holy Island is marked. It's a tidal island, about 7 or 8 miles south of the Scottish border and the town of Beric on Tweed, where the historic border begins. It's best known as the cradle of English Christianity and its association with the saints Aidan and Cuthbert and the monastic site that they set up. And that site was probably the first in Britain to be raided by the Vikings in 793 AD. And the island is largely known for that, particularly to tourists. The castle is very visible on the island, but it's often mistaken for the monastic site. The next slide shows what is the earliest picture we have of the castle. This dates to 1683 from a military survey that was done there, and shows a rather nice version of the English cross of St. George and the cross of St. Andrew of Scotland flying above the tower. It was first built in the 1540s. By the end of that decade, actually, it was probably in some sort of state as it appears in the picture, possibly with a lot of recycled stone from the nearby priory. The priory had been dissolved during in the Reformation and Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. And so there was an awful lot of perfect stone waiting in the village to be used. It was quite strategically important, as Martin touched on in the introduction, in the Anglo-Scottish conflicts, particularly into the 16th century. But with the union of the crowns in 1603, after the death of Elizabeth I, it declined quite massively in significance. However, its importance was shown that it was deemed important enough at least to be captured in the Civil War in 1643, and also again during one of the Jacobite rebellions in 1715. Again, the fact that it was constantly garrisoned right through this period, right up until just before Hudson visited the back end of the 19th century, shows that it did have an importance to national security. The next page, the next slide at least, is an aerial photograph. Again, just to give you a bit of context as to where I'm talking about. At the top left of the picture, you can see the town of Beric on Tweed, and then the coast swings round onto the north coast of Holy Island. At the bottom left corner of the island is the village where the original priory buildings are. Just to the right of that is the harbour. And the harbour is probably the most strategically important thing at Holy Island. That's why the castle is built in the first place, to protect that harbour, which is a launch pad for any English attacks on Scotland. And the castle is built to protect that. And you can see the castle on the bottom right corner of the island, the southeastern tip, up on its rocky crag there, overlooking the harbour, but also the sea lanes to the east of the island. The next slide is a view of the castle today, looking at it from the west, from the approach from the village. And again, the profile is very similar to that earlier Victorian photograph we saw. The next slide shows it from the north, from the garden which Gertrude Jekyll laid out during the Lutyens restoration. And the castle up there on its rock. It does look a little different from the north because it's quite a long building, and the previous slide showing it from one of the sort of narrow ends it is quite deceptive, as it is from the south, which is the next slide, looking up at it from down on the shoreline there just last summer. But then we go back in history again to the next slide, which is a view of Lindisfarne at low tide, very similar to the one I took last summer, this one painted by John Varley in 1808. And I use that really just as a quick comparison to show you that although Lutyens has made several changes, the profile is largely the same, and it's a very sympathetic restoration that he gave us. A couple more historic shots next. So the next slide is an interior, which was only recently discovered, but this was painted in 1862 by the watercolorist John Wickham Archer. He calls this the Great Hall, but today we would recognize this as the ship room, and we'll see an interior of that soon. The next slide is another by Wickham Archer from 1862, showing the dining room next door. He calls it the kitchen, and it certainly was referred to as the castle kitchen on other plans. You can see actually on the left-hand side, there's a couple of dark areas, which are, one is a bread oven, which dates right back to the Tudor period, and the other is a salt hole for storing salt for the garrison. So quite a significant room in there. The next slide is an exterior shot by Wickham Archer, showing one of the guns at the castle. This was a recently mounted gun from the early 1860s. There's two more on the lower battery, and this was the final armament the castle had. The building on the right was in those days part of a magazine which held the castle's ammunition supplies, and it was a very carefully designed building, which was strong on the sides but a little weaker on the top to allow any accidental explosion to be blown upwards rather than outwards and flatten the building. We'll see a little more of that western building later on and what Lutyens does to it. The next slide shows a military plan from 1883, so not long after Wickham Archer had sketched or painted the picture of the cannon. And at the bottom of the picture, you can see the racers that held the gun and the two crossed red lines showing the field of fire. And up on the left there, with the section marks on it, is that western building with the gunpowder magazine shown. Lutyens is going to make quite a lot of changes to the plan of the castle, but actually it does retain its sort of rough L shape. The next plan I'm going to show you on the next slide actually is orientated slightly differently. So the east elevation we see on the military plan on the right-hand side will suddenly drop to the bottom of the page. But Robin, if we can have the next slide, showing the Lutyens drawing that was done probably in about 1901 or 1902, showing what he found. So this is Lutyens' drawing of the military building. He's already starting to make some changes. He scribbles things out and so on. But you can see there's staircases inside. So, for example, as you come up into the castle from outside and onto the lower battery and into the entrance hall, what is now the entrance hall is made up of a sitting room, a passageway, a staircase, a scullery, and a lobby, all within what is now Lutyens' entrance hall. The dining room is a cartridge or shell filling room, and indeed the famous ship room has a gunpowder magazine itself in, and some adjoining walls, some internal walls, which Lutyens is going to quickly get rid of, I think. The next slide is Lutyens' as finished plan, and it shows here again we changed orientation, unfortunately, but you can see there that there is an entrance hall has appeared with 3 columns inside. And I should say that the inked in sections are those that Lutyens has introduced, and the cross hatches are the original building. You get a really good idea here of him wrestling with that existing structure. The ship room and dining room are complete there, as is the new kitchen to the south of the entrance hall. The next slide is included really out of interest. It's a remarkable picture that we were sent not long ago, and we're still really trying to interpret it. I'm particularly excited about it because it shows the Queen's Battery, which was visible on the military plan and Lutyens' before plan. So it's a rare picture of a part of the castle that no longer exists as it's been built upon. But I'm particularly intrigued by the figure on the left, who I think may well be Edwin Lutyens. I can't really prove that, and I'm struggling to find evidence that it actually is him. But we don't have any other pictures of him at the castle. And it's going to take a little bit more work to prove it one way or the other, I think. So we get into Lutyens' work in 1903. And the next slide is a photograph of the castle from the northeast, looking up at the building. if we go straight onto the next slide, Robin, you'd be able to see the castle in slightly more detail. And this really is a remarkable picture because it shows the work has begun. I think this dates to the summer of 1905, possibly May or June of 1903, I beg your pardon. And you can see on the right-hand side of the picture is the north elevation. The 3 arched windows have been installed. They're Lutyens' creations and designs. You can see to the left of them, 2 smaller windows have been inserted into the wall, and above them, 6 more lights have been built. And you can see how the builders have taken down the parapet wall and excavated down and rebuilt it all. What really fascinates me, though, is that the east elevation on the left there is completely intact. So that is the Victorian and possibly even the 18th century elevation with those sash windows. You can even see on the right-hand side there under the flagpole, that is the old Western building that Wickham Archer sketched with that mono-pitch roof. And that is the Queen Battery as well below it, which the group of people were standing on the last photograph. This really is a wonderful snapshot right at the beginning of the Lutyens renovation, where we can see the old Victorian building, the old military building, still just about surviving, despite some of the additions being made. And the A-frame cranes you can see there for hauling stone up the big spoil heaps at the base of the castle ramp. I just wanted to show you the next slide quickly, because this is a truly remarkable discovery that we made in the recent building project. We know very, very little about the men that actually carried out the restoration work for Lutyens. But we do know about this man, Tom Bruce of Beric, and you can see he's written his name on the back of one of the lapboards in what actually was Edward Hudson's bedroom. And we discovered this during some investigation work during the project. What really was remarkable about this was that a few weeks after the discovery of this inscription, a lady asked me about whether we knew of any of the workers in the Lutyens restoration, and I mentioned that we just found this guy's name, and I asked her what her surname was, and it was Bruce. And not only was she called Pamela Bruce, but she'd visited from Western Australia on the off chance that we might know about her relative. So we got a photograph of him from her, and most of his backstory as well. So I'd like to give you a quick tour around the Lutyens house. And this is going to be a mixture of contemporary photographs with the restoration and modern pictures to give you an idea of how the castle looks now. So we start at the bottom of the ramp, and Lutyens has got rid of the wall that Charles Rennie Mackintosh sketched, which runs up the left-hand side of that cobbled path, all the way up to the front door. And he also got rid of the old gatehouse, which you would have been able to see from the bottom of the ramp. The doorway would have been at the very top step there, and he hid the door around the corner. And so on the next slide, you can see that door, complete with wooden portcullis hidden up above the door there. And you will walk around through that door and round the corner and be faced with yet another set of steps and another open door at the top with daylight. And when you get onto the lower battery, which is shown on the next slide, you still don't really know where you're going, because the entrance hall door, and Robin, if we can move on to the next slide quickly to the modern picture, the entrance hall door is along there to the right. So the first time visitor emerges completely oblivious of where they're supposed to be going. And this is the first one of Lutyens' little jokes that he hides within this building, and there's lots of them. And I still get caught out by them sometimes today. One of the things I get caught out of are some of the low doorways. I'm 6'4", and I bang my head quite a lot on them, particularly those big ones. You can see on either end of this picture, the left hand and right hand doors have these enormous door lintels, and you see that a lot through the house, the way that he plays with scale, and you see different size stones all around, and small rooms have large things in them. It's one of his main traits in the building. We go into the first room, which is the entrance hall, and I realize I've managed to get through nearly half of the slides without letting Hugh speak. And I know Hugh would really like to talk about the way that Lutyens has installed these columns in the entrance hall. Hugh, if you're still awake.
Well,
Nick, I know you're doing very well. Thank you very much.
Hugh, could I interrupt? Hugh, excuse me, it's Martin. Could I interrupt you for a second? There have been 2 signals on the bottom of my screen saying that people are having problems with the sound. I don't think that's generally the case. It's absolutely fine for me, but I don't know if there's any correction that can be made or whether the fault is at their end. Excuse me for intervening, but I just thought you should know.
Thank you, Martin. Well, we're here in the entrance hall, and it really is the excitement which Lutyens wanted to bring in. Originally, coming into this building, you went into a very narrow and rather boring passage. He opened it up in both directions and uses these clearly features which have a medieval origin, but they're not slavish copies. They have the weight and character that you'd expect if you go just down the road and look at the fragments of Lindisfarne Priory or at Durham Cathedral, for example, but they're actually not copies. They don't have bases and they don't have capitals. They run as clean shafts up into the mouldings, which sort of die into them. This is not simply reproducing medieval things, but giving you the character of a medieval interior with the weight and atmosphere of it, but actually creating something entirely unique to him, and something which gives the immediate entrance to inside the building such character. If we look at this in color in the next picture, you get an idea of how originally when Hudson was there and Country Life were taking pictures, the furnishing was rather more sparse. But we have to remember that there were two other owners, including the donor, Mr. Stein, who occupied the place, and there was more build-up of furnishings, things like the deck chairs used on the batteries and luggage coming to and fro, which had been introduced into the castle. My predecessor wanted to put up all kinds of antimacassars and hanging things, and part of my job was to remove all of that and make it look more like it had been. But that's one of the problems of curatorship. But this is such a space that it looks through, and you're looking right through here from round columns to polygonal ones, a bit like many medieval churches in England, and right the way through to the wind indicator on the other side. And Nick is a specialist on wind indicators.
Thank you for that, Hugh. I'm not sure I agree with you, but yes, the wind indicator, if we're on to the next slide, Robin, is probably our single most significant object in the collection, and it was commissioned for that very space above the fireplace by Edwin Lutyens, and the artist and installer was MacDonald Gill, who worked with Lutyens a fair bit actually, and they seem to have a similar approach to decorative art. They're very humorous artists in their own way, and MacDonald Gill has certainly filled this picture with little bits of humor everywhere. I particularly like the central map showing the island with monks marching up and down the nave of what is a ruined priory, which is rather nice. And the Spanish Armada there on the right being blown away by the providential wind on the north, the top left of the picture. The wonderful secret about the wind indicator, of course, is that it indicates where the wind is going, and the pointer in the center is attached to a wind vane on the roof. The wind vane turns round and the pointer moves accordingly. I do think, though, this is yet another of Lutyens, of perhaps Gill's dark jokes for the visitor who has struggled their way up the ramp, probably with a very strong wind blowing them either along or into their face, only to be told which way the wind is blowing when they get into the sanctuary of the entrance hall. And many visitors get that joke when they walk in. MacDonald Gill may be familiar to some of you, particularly on the West Coast, with his work on the Queen Mary. The next slide, I think Robin has a photograph of Max, which was kindly given to us by his family. I think Caroline might even be on the call on the Zoom, and his incredible picture in I think it's the dining room on the Queen Mary, showing the Atlantic there with a moving ship, which apparently ticks along as the diners were having their dinner between America and the UK, which is rather nice. And yeah, his wind indicator is a really important part of our collection. If you go on to the next slide, though, you get an idea of the sort of things that Lutyens was installing in the house. This is the kitchen. The dresser on the right was a bespoke piece for that space, and I'm almost certain that that has never moved since 1912, since it was installed there. We did try and move it in the project a couple of years ago, but quickly realised that we weren't going to be able to shift it at all. Things like that wonderful settle on the left-hand side, the copper work by Benson on the fireplace, above the fireplace, and the little hint there of blue and white china on the dresser, and indeed on the table. The kitchen table, which is sort of hidden by my plan that I put in the bottom left-hand corner, was also a bespoke piece. And I think most of the bespoke pieces arrived towards the end of the restoration in 1912. So some of the earlier photographs don't actually feature them. If we pop onto the next picture, you get a glimpse into the ship room passage. So this is leaving the entrance hall, heading down that long side of the L shape that we saw on the plan earlier. The steps on the left head up to the upper battery. Those are probably as old as they get at the castle, and appeared on plans as right back into the 16th century. But we're going to head down the passageway to the right there and into the dining room. And the next slide is a shot from 1906 showing the dining room as John Wickham Archer would have recognised in 1862. But you can tell already that Lutyens has started making changes. You can see a fireplace has appeared. The chimney piece arch has been altered,
Nick.
and of course,
Oh,
yes, I beg your pardon.
Sorry, no, we've now moved from Wickham Archer to the Lutyens view. It's okay.
Oh, lovely, thank you. Yeah. So yeah, I can't see what Robin is doing. My screen's frozen on the title page, so I'm navigating through my own. So yes, the country life picture, you can see the beginnings of that collection appearing in the dining room. And a fearsome amount of wood on the right-hand side of the fireplace. They tended to burn wood at the castle rather than coal, and it tended to be bits of boats that were broken up in the harbour and brought up for firewood. The next shot is a modern picture looking in the opposite direction, showing the dining table that was designed for the room. A beautiful, beautiful piece of work, and a rather stark and glorious blue wall at the far end there. The blue wall is an interesting feature in the castle, and actually it currently isn't blue. It's, since the project has gone back to being white at the moment. But the blue you see there was an installation in the late 1970s as a result of some electrical work. But we now know from the restoration project what the original paint was on that wall, and it was a slightly lighter blue than that. But we have the pigment worked out, and we are going to be able to restore that in the coming years, and I really look forward to getting that colour back on the wall. Into the next room, the next slide is the ship room. Again, John Wickham Archer sketched it or recorded it for us as the Great Hall in 1862. But if we go on to the next part of this slide is one of the early country life photographs of the ship room, and you can see at the top of the room, or in the ceiling, is the ship from which the room takes its name, a model of a Dutch vessel called the Henrietta. And we have chandeliers and tables and chairs, and even a small library appearing on the left of the fireplace. The ship room today, looking back in the other direction, and the next slide shows us that, has slightly more furnishings in there. And many of these come from...
I think we've lost Nick, and Hugh, can
I
you?
think what Nick was about to say is that what we've got is this rather Dutch interior type here. It was the Dutch who first started hanging ships from their ceilings, demonstrating their expertise in trade. But here it was clearly done deliberately with imported furniture. If you can see, the painted cabinet at the end is actually a Dutch piece, and the carving of the furniture generally is intended to give that interior, and we know that. And if we go now back down the corridor that came and up the stairs, we come to, this is the country life view of the gallery upstairs, with a door on the right, which was the second phase, which went through to rooms created on the Queen's Battery. So here we've got this combination, which Hudson and Lutyens liked, of fairly firm furniture, another piece by Lutyens on the right-hand side with the great single baluster at each end of the table, and ranges of prints as well, and another cabinet at the end. And the next slide shows similar view, but actually from slightly further back, you see the the arches over the stairs at the landing. So you're looking at the same space here, with slightly less furniture now because of the movement of visitors. It gets very crowded in this area. Generally, the spaces in the castle are quite small, and that's one of the challenges of showing it to people on popular days. But you do get this idea of sort of the weight of the arches and the steps, never straight, they're always slightly curved or irregular. And then the paving, which you can't really see very well here, is actually herringbone brick, the sort of thing you'd expect in the home counties in English farms, but here introduced into the north, just to give changes that Lutyens like so much, changes of space and changes of materials. And if we go on into one of those north rooms, we have on the right-hand side this extraordinary chimney piece. He made great features of the chimneys. This huge Bressumer stone right the way across the top of the fire, contrasted with really quite small tile-like bricks as the fireplace. And again, rather sparse Dutch light-colored surround. I mean, this is overlit here, obviously, for effect, but again, with the contrast between light background and heavy furniture. And then the next slide shows that we've actually got onto the upper battery, and we've already seen this looking from the other end with the great gun. You can just see the swivels in the gun place here on the right-hand side. And this extraordinary combination that, although Lutyens didn't hugely change the amount of building there, he introduced elements like the polygonal tower on the left-hand side with its corbelled arrangement, looking as though he'd just come from Scotland, where indeed he had just come from. But it's very much a way of extending accommodation in the upper part of a tower. And at the far end, what looks like crow-step gables is actually a sort of hit and miss staircase leading up onto the roof, because you can get onto the roofs if you hold onto your hat in both places. And the next slide shows the sort of, oh, hello. Nick, you're back. I was just going to say the next slide, I mean, this shows exactly what they were trying to do. This is Hudson and Vermeer, Hudson and Lutyens creating sort of Vermeer interiors, Dutch paintings. This is Lutyens' daughter Barbie on the left-hand side playing with a model farm, which I understand the family still have. We're hoping they might lend it to the castle on some occasion. And on the right-hand side, her playing a spinet up on the gallery. And this is quite deliberately set up. It's we're trying to find out who the photographer was, but clearly that was the impression. We're trying to have a Vermeer or a Peter de Hoogh painting, which he was creating. Nick, we missed you. Would you like to take over?
I'm very kind of you. I'm sorry I disappeared for a second there. Yes, so thank you very much, Hugh. The next slide is a rather wonderful cartoon drawn by Lutyens of himself and Barbie and Hudson. And it's probably the best slide I could show you to illustrate the two men's relationship. This was not a relationship between an architect and his client. These were two friends, two men who were very close. Particularly, I think Hudson thought an awful lot of Lutyens. Lutyens treated Hudson kindly, but I think some of the ways he spoke about him in his letters was far from kind. But this is a beautiful picture to show that these were two men who were very friendly. Hudson was extremely fond of Lutyens' children, and they spent an awful lot of time at Lindisfarne as guests, not necessarily with Hudson present either. And we know that Lutyens actually continued to visit the castle long after the major works had been completed. And it was, I think, 1919 when the last family holiday happened at Holy Island. There was a rather important event, though, earlier on in 1908, and the next slide is, I must apologize for it, it's a rather poor photograph taken of a picture behind glass, but it's as good as I could get, I'm afraid. And this is a picture of the royal visit to Holy Island. And I'm afraid it doesn't feature Hudson or Lutyens or anyone else relating to the castle, but it does feature the Prince of Wales, the future King George V, in the centre at the back row with a white hat on. And just in front of him, he's looking down at it, is the future Queen Mary, the Princess of Wales. these two visited the castle, I think just after this photograph was taken, and met an extremely excited Lutyens and an extremely nervous Hudson, who showed them round the house. Lutyens records this event in a letter to his wife, and it's a really extraordinary letter. And Hudson, as I say, was extremely nervous, but Lutyens thoroughly enjoyed himself. And I think it was a seminal moment for him as well, because he met the Prince of Wales, who later on, a couple of years later, he would speak to about the commission in New Delhi. And it could be seen that the Lindisfarne meeting was a bit of an icebreaker, and possibly made that later meeting a little easier for both men. So that sort of closes the tour of the castle, and I think the next slide will be possibly quite a surprise, having seen what we've gone through so far. Yes,
Nick, you almost mentioned, I mean, the point was that Prince of Wales was 2 years later, he was King George V, and they were just about to embark on vice-regal architecture in India, which of course became Lutyens' great work. Sorry, you go to your scaffolding.
No, you're quite right. I'm just keen to talk about scaffolding, Hugh. I do apologise. So this is a photograph I took back in 2017, and you can see that the castle's profile has changed quite dramatically because of that enormous scaffold. And the next slide, Robin, will give you an even better impression of the scale of this piece of engineering, which we didn't really appreciate at the time, but it actually attracted visitors to the island solely to see the scaffolding. There was a gentleman came over from Canada purely to see the scaffolding. He wasn't that interested in the castle or early Christianity or anything. And the next slide is another view from the southwest. Again, just giving an impression that because of the castle's profile on that hill, it is extremely difficult to get up to access those elevations. And so an enormous scaffold is required just to get out far enough to find some solid ground to be based on. I should say as well that none of that scaffold was actually physically attached to the crag. It sits on pieces of carpet and timber, so it almost floats against the crag, although we did screw it down to the castle itself. The conservation project, as Martin touched on at the very start, was largely designed to improve the castle's condition to make it maintainable going forward. It had got to the stage where there was an awful lot of major work required simply to keep the castle watertight. We don't really talk about waterproofing it. If anything, the castle was waterproof in the Victorian period when it was covered in cement. We actually wanted to allow the castle to breathe. If moisture got into the structure, we wanted it to be able to get out again. And the problem in the past was that it couldn't. This picture, this next slide here of the long gallery shows the wall on the south side of the long gallery. So this is a purely Lutyens construct. The arch at the end there, and I don't know if Hugh spoke about this while I was off there, is the wall into the western building that we saw right at the beginning of that photograph of who I think is Lutyens on the old Queen's Battery. This wall was constructed in about 1904, and it's got a most incredible join, that vertical line to the left of the window between the 1904 structure and the earlier military building, those large stones on the left. Behind that wall, there is virtually no void. The rubble fill has all but gone due to water ingress over the centuries. So this was one particular example of that process that was going on, of water tracking through the building, not being able to get out and causing damage that was invisible to us largely. You can also see some other parts of the Lutyens intervention. The arches above the window required to take the weight of the wall above those windows. It wasn't so much a problem in there, but in other parts of the house, and if we go on to the next slide, you will see that it really did cause a problem, that the design of the windows, particularly with that sort of T-shaped lintel in the center with a very, very short vertical piece, was causing possible structural issues. And it seems that later on, that metal beams had been installed above the stone. And you can see here in the west bedroom, these are actually Victorian railway lines that have been brought in to do the job. We're not sure exactly when, but it's probably during the restoration work in around 1906 that these were put in there. These would probably have been used as ballast in shipping, so they'd have been pretty freely available down in the harbour. We had to take these out. They weren't in really very good condition, but we have replaced all metal beams we found in the wall with modern RSJs. The next slide is just an example of the sort of window water ingress we were experiencing prior to the project. This is a video of water coming in. This is the inside of a window during a storm on the eastern elevation. This was a common occurrence in the years before 2016, and it was a regular part of my job to go around and mop all this sort of stuff up. We discovered, if we go on to the next slide, Robin, we discovered that there was a simple problem with the window design, in that the window wasn't in a groove, it was simply rebaited against the stone. And you can see there the glass panel is up against a sort of L-shaped bit of stone with a screw and a piece of mortar holding it in. And that mortar fillet would fail, particularly on those inaccessible elevations, and water would simply get around the side of the lead. In order to combat that, the glaziers we worked with came up with a solution, which you can see on the next slide, which are two L-shaped brass bars, or four actually on each window, that would be attached and create a groove basically. And then they would, as you can see on the next slide, be covered with a sand mastic mixture, which was just a linseed oil and sand, which would expand and contract with temperature and shouldn't fail as often as the mortar fillet did. One of the only drawings we actually have from the Lutyens renovation at Lindisfarne is the next slide, showing the tracery windows that were installed on the north elevation, which you may remember from some of the earlier photographs I showed you. Unfortunately, we found when we got up the scaffold that these windows were in pretty terrible condition in 2015. And we decided eventually we took a really tough decision to take all of the stone out and replace it. One of the consolations was that we knew that we had this drawing to refer to, and we were able to pass that on to our stonemason. In the next slide, that's Alan reinstalling or installing the newly carved stones that he had prepared, and he worked in conjunction with the historic glazier to get the window back, or all three windows in fact, back into the wall. One of the only other drawings we have, I should say as well, from Lutyens, which are currently held at RIBA, the Victoria and Albert Museum, is this one of a water spout or spitter or gargoyle, I think Lutyens calls it, in the top corner. And these are all around the building, or were, and they project out from the walls, and water is thrown off the side and down onto the ground. Unfortunately, with Holy Island being so windy, often that water is blown straight back onto the wall. And in fact, on the north elevation, there was one instance of water hitting windows from these spouts. Most of them actually we've been able to block up and reroute the water elsewhere. But in one instance, and you'll see on the next slide, we actually had to carve a new one. And so again, we were able to make use of these original drawings to introduce a really authentic spitter up onto the wall. The next slide is the north elevation. Again, you remember from the earlier photographs, and those are those tracery windows before the project. And you can see some of the problems we were having with the roof drainage manifesting themselves on that north elevation. You can see failed gutters there. There's water damage around the hopper and the drain pipe on the left there, and below the windows, the green sign of water spilling down there. There was all sorts of problems. We discovered that drain pipe was dealing with about 2/3, about 65% at least of our rainfall on the roof. And so we had to make some pretty drastic changes to the roof layout and the drainage in order to reduce that amount. And so the next slide, you can see one of our joiners preparing a softwood roof up on what would be the north central roof of the castle, in order to take water away to the south. So the drain pipe I just referenced is between that chimney and that pan-tile roof. And what we wanted to do was take water away towards where I'm taking the photograph. And in the next slide, you can see the completed lead roof slightly higher up with channels leading towards that parapet wall. We then installed 3 brand new drain pipes on the upper battery, which then make use of historic drainage below the battery, which actually join up to that spitter we just saw a couple of slides ago. And water is then discharged straight onto the south slopes of the rock and into the sea. The next slide, and penultimate slide actually of this presentation, is another aspect of the restoration project, which wasn't necessarily to do with trying to keep water out. This was an opportunity for us to restore some of the original aesthetics that had been lost in the course of the 20th century. I think Hugh touched on the fact that after Hudson, there were a couple of other owners before the National Trust took the castle on. And the photograph in the lower part of the center of the picture, you can see is a sort of a rubble wall painted. That was done by Oswald Falk in the 1920s. So he's actually changed.
Over to you, Hugh.
We've lost Nick. And what he was trying to say is that with the rather harsh treatment of the wall has been replaced with the softer thing, which you see with Robert looking through the spy hole there. And that
Hugh,
simply got clogged up with too much.
Hugh, that would be Robert Lutyens, his son, correct?
That is correct. Yes, that's right. Yeah. That's the general treatment which they've been trying to reintroduce. I can imagine. I think the trust has been looking after the castle now about 3 times as long as Hudson looked after it. So things have been accumulating this way and that. And our final picture, which really should be Nick's peroration here, shows a picture of the castle after the project with all the scaffolding gone, looking its best as far as we can with the sunset striking on the west side of the castle. And of course, what the trust is trying to do is to keep the building going, to try and get people to have an experience of this extraordinary combination, really, of patron and architect coming together so that people can still appreciate that. And as Nick is just about to say, the whole point is to carry this forward into the future.
Beautifully done, Hugh. I couldn't have put it better myself. Thank you.
I'm sure you could.
No, that's everything. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. And as Martin said at the beginning, as long as I don't drop out again, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Yep. Thank you all for coming and listening to our webinar, and please feel free to ask questions. Thank you to Nick and to Hugh. You've done a brilliant job under some technical issues and given us a nice tour of the castle. If you, we would ask that if you're interested in more about Lutyens, that you go and see Lindisfarne and that you consider joining the Lutyens Trust America or Lutyens Trust, or if you've already joined, to renew your membership. And thank you for watching. And now I'll turn it over to Marcos Lutyens for questions.
Thank you, everybody. Here's the first question from Ewan Easton. James Lees Milne, in his diary, attached real importance to the Hudson furnishings, all of which were, of course, gifted to the trust. They were what made the castle totally Lutyens. When can we expect to see them fully reinstated?
That's a good question. I think one of the main reasons we had to remove them, obviously for the main project a couple of years ago, was the likelihood of damage and things during the work. Initially, we tried to do the project with full public access, which would have involved keeping some rooms open and things like that. As the course of the project went on, due to various issues with programming and actually barn owls, strangely enough, we ended up having to delay the return of the furniture. That was not the plan originally. The idea was that the castle would be ready for the furnishings when we got the place back from the contractors. But due to things like plaster drying out and things, we had to delay it. That required us to come up with a new visitor experience. We essentially were opening to the public 2 months' time with no furniture at all and no visitor experience. So it was quite a frantic few months in 2018. What that has allowed us to do, though, is tell slightly different stories in the castle, admittedly. The Lutyens Hudson scheme is quite defined. It talks about a particular, very particular point in the castle's history. So one of the things we've done over the past few years is talk about the military side, for example. But gradually we are bringing the Hudson collection back, particularly what we'd think of as the sort of grade A stuff, the dresser that you saw in the kitchen, for example, the dining table, the ship, the Max Gill's wind indicator was returned pretty early on. And so as we go through this process, we're actually doing something called a collections review, where myself and a couple of curatorial colleagues go through our collection with a very fine-tooth comb, and we are assessing what we have with several motives in mind, one of which is to try and better understand our collections, but also to try and prioritize what we have, because over the course of the last 80 or 90 years, we've collected quite a lot of extra stuff, which is not necessarily relevant to the Hudson Lutyens period. And so particularly actually in the last 40 years, and Hugh will probably be able to tell you about some of the pieces. But we're looking whether we can move those things on, and whether we can then concentrate our resources on the key items from Hudson and Lutyens time. I think an direct answer to the question, I don't know the real answer as to when we'll have everything back as was. And what I'd like to do is try and investigate more the country life images, for example, but also oral testimonies about where things were in the house, as to how we then redisplay the place. Because I personally thought that by 2015, the displays in the house were getting a bit tired. They'd been like that for 50 years without being changed, and they weren't necessarily based on anything authentic. So I'm very keen to revisit this in using the collection and making, I suppose, getting more from our collection as well, rather than just having things standing in the corner for the sake of it, actually getting them to tell us stories. So it's a fascinating time actually to be working with the collection at Lindisfarne. Sorry, does that answer your question?
Let's move on to the next question. That's a great answer. Eve Hadema asks, one of the important parts of Lutyens' designs have always been the gardens as outdoor rooms. How does he try to implement that here, since the main garden is further away, if I remember correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. The Jekyll garden, which I think I very briefly touched on earlier on, is across the other side of the field from us, from the castle. It should be said actually that there were intentions earlier on to do far more with the area to the north of the castle, between the garden and the castle. Hudson was very keen to flood the field and turn it into a little fishing lake. Perhaps he could shoot some ducks and things, which he liked to do. He also was keen to use the walled garden as a tennis court or a croquet lawn, and indeed he would like to have built gatehouses on the way up to the castle to give it give more drama to the route there. That didn't happen, possibly for financial reasons. But we're actually doing some work at the moment to investigate just how much the landscape around the castle is a planned and designed landscape, even though it looks like it's hardly been touched and it's only the garden really that's been modified. Actually, there's a lot more subtlety going on. For example, the north elevation of the castle, the north elevation of the castle crag, was heavily landscaped in 1910 and 11 to remove old trackways from a lime kiln, which was quite a substantial operation, and they had wagon ways running around the castle crag. These were all taken out. These were smoothed out. And other examples as well, that there's a lot going on in the landscape, but it's extremely subtle. And we're trying just to get to the bottom of that. Certainly Lutyens was very keen to emphasize that his windows on the north side that look out of the ship room and dining room that we've talked about, they are designed for people to be able to get up and look out of them. They're high up off the ground, but he's put steps in on the inside, particularly for children, to be able to see out of the windows. So that, yeah, you can see that he's desperately trying to bring the outside into the castle. And actually, as I said, there's probably a lot more going on outside than meets the eye.
Nick, this was actually a site that Gertrude Jekyll came and visited, correct? Yeah, she visited at least once, possibly twice, in 1906, and she had a wonderful time at Lindisfarne. She brought a raven with her for the castle. I think belonged to Lutyens' sister-in-law's dentist. She brought a large packet of sweets and her surveying equipment and her paints, and she sang songs for the guests. She had a wonderful time dangling small boys off the castle walls to plant flowers in the crag, and firing seeds at the crag with a fowling gun. She sounds like she had an absolute wonderful time.
I think we could say that Gertrude Jekyll's designs do survive, and they are in, I think, in California, in university campus. Is it San Diego? Professor Michael Tooley made a special study of them. One of the challenges the National Trust has is that it wants the garden on the north side of the castle, which is very carefully designed with sort of eyebrow walls to focus on the castle. But we want it to be slightly more attractive to visitors over a longer period. It was clearly originally designed to be mainly a garden for the summer visitors. But that has changed. It's also fair to say that the Jekyll designs are really quite difficult to translate, and sometimes inevitably they are contradictory, but they have been used as the basis for the present garden planting.
Yes, and it's one of the very few Jekyll gardens, certainly in the National Trust, that is pretty much authentic to her planning.
Hugh, would you like to say anything about the geometry of the garden? It's rather unusual.
I'd love to, if you can bear it. Yes, it's a little bit of Borromini in Northumberland, that he designed it not as a rectangle, but with a vanishing point guiding all the lines of the garden beds. And I think Michael Tooley worked out that it didn't quite work. It was meant to work for people approaching from or viewing from the lower battery. You know, that's the best view of the garden from there. But in fact, the way it was laid out made the viewpoint about 200 feet above the lower battery, which rather compromised it. But when you're in the garden, you wonder what on earth is going on with the slightly diminishing size paths going to the back, and with them all converging slightly. And the idea was to give an appearance of extent in the garden.
Can I just add to that, Hugh, that when the scaffolding was up, I took the opportunity that gave us to be about 50 feet above the lower battery. So I tried to take a photograph there, and I sent it to Michael Tooley and said, "What do you think?" And he said, "That's nearly there." Not far off, but not quite right.
We'd love to see the photograph.
But actually, it's an interesting point that Michael thought it was the lower battery, but in the work we're doing with the landscape, the designed landscape theory, is that actually it could be that the garden was designed to be seen when you get to the top of the castle ramp and you round the corner, and that there was a gap between the castle and the upturned boat sheds, and that you would see the garden between them.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, in 2007, someone on this call was present for the building of a new admissions hut, which is plonked right in the middle of that view. So if that theory is true, then we might need to think about relocating our admissions hut.
Sounds a good idea, Nick.
I think we have time for one quick question, and then we'll wrap it up. Tim Hinkle, what architectural and engineering practices designed and managed the restoration work? Have you archived the construction drawings they prepared?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from the very off, actually, that was one of the key objectives in the planning of the project, was that we wanted to be really meticulous with record keeping. Looking back at previous work on the castle, we were really struggling to understand the decision-making processes and things like that as to why certain materials had been used in certain areas. So yes, we've recorded absolutely everything. We've created a building information model. So we have a three-dimensional model of the castle, which we're going to use going forward as a management tool to record work that's being done, but also to plan it. We're just using it at the moment to inform some work on the back of some storm damage we had at the end of last year. So it's a really important part of the work. The contract architects we used were a conservation architect firm in Edinburgh called Simpson and Brown, who have been working with the National Trust at Lindisfarne since the 1980s. Very familiar with the building, of course, but also very high quality conservation architects. And they bring in engineering firms and things like that to work with them. So I think we're in a good place in terms of that. I don't know, Hugh, if you want to add anything from your experience at the castle.
No, that was fine. And I mean, the great strength of having James Simpson and his firm looking after the castle for a long period, particularly before the really serious funds became available. I'm not jealous at all, Nick, that you had so much money to spend, but it did mean that the castle was being examined by those architects and recorded for quite a long time before the really big project got going, which has been a real advantage.
And at this point, the scaffolding is down, correct?
Yeah, it's all gone. We do get asked that question a lot because it features quite a lot on Google image searches. So if people are looking to plan their visit to Holy Island and they see this massive monstrosity still on the side of the castle, no, it was all gone by September of 2018. It took about 4 months to take it down, though.
So I think it's been an incredible webinar, but unfortunately, I think it's time to round things off. Robin, would you like to round things off for us?
Just thank you all for coming. Thank you to our panel. I think you've done a wonderful job. And I was lucky enough to visit Lindisfarne last fall, and I hope you all will plan a trip there because it's well worth the effort. It's a wonderful spot. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you.